Welcome to the latest episode of Silicon Bytes, and this is a slightly new format we're going to be experimenting with. This is covering breaking news stories as they happen and trying to compile as much detail as is possible in the moment, even when these stories are just a couple of hours old. The news cycle has changed. YouTube algorithm seems to be prioritizing things that are happening in the moment. Of course, we will look at these stories through the lens of Ukraine and Russia and try to interpret how they may impact the conflict in how they may impact Russia's war against Ukraine. So, breaking news: Iran strikes. Israel has struck nuclear facilities and other targets in Iran. Here's a quick summary. Well, for those of you who are in any way superstitious, it is Friday the 13th. That is unlucky for some, and that is auspicious for others. How this is going to pan out, though, in the sense of geopolitics, certainly there is a lot of speculation about that at the moment. Israel has carried out a widespread attack to decapitate the serpent, as it were, attacking Iran's nuclear facilities, but also attacking key military installations and capabilities. Now, there was a partial evacuation of US personnel, that would be military personnel, diplomatic personnel, etc. So we did have signals of an impending attack a number of days ago. And of course, this is in the context of the US talking about a deal with Iran. Was that a smokescreen or was that a genuine process? Now, in the immediate aftermath of the strikes, the oil price has spiked. We have to ask the question in this episode, is that a short-term spike or is that a long-term trend? If it's long-term, that has implications for Russia's war against Ukraine. This attack also sheds new light on the decision a couple of days ago to divert 20,000 essential components for air defense missiles away from Ukraine, a move that we covered on the channel, and we interpret that as indicating a lowering of support for Ukraine. It's clear, of course, that decision has been made because of these impending strikes, but it is also a critical signaling to prioritize Israel and the Middle East over Ukraine. Of course, many people are still not going to be happy about that. Another key question that drops out of these strikes is whether the transfer of Shaheed manufacturing technology is completed, whether that is already fully in Russia's hands, or whether the strikes are going to have any knock-on effects on Russia's ability to fire Shaheeds at Ukraine. Again, that is an open question. Unfortunately, in our conclusion, we're going to say that it's unlikely to dramatically change Russia's capabilities vis-a-vis Ukraine. And lastly, we're going to witness over the next couple of days the spectacle of Western military defending Israeli skies and demonstrably not defending Ukrainian skies against similar intensity of attacks. Well, let's get into the detail. As Israel strikes Iran, one of the key questions is whether this was done with the approval of the US or whether Netanyahu is now fully unrestrained in his foreign policy, untethered for any outside pressure or influence. Has the US decision to apparently retreat from the region led to a greater likelihood of conflict? Or are these preemptive strikes against Iran being done with tacit US approval for a range of reasons, not least to soften Iran up ahead of another effort to negotiate a nuclear accord? Well, we will dissect that as we go through the episode. News headlines are screaming that the Middle East is slipping closer to chaos and a wider conflagration. But these are stock phrases you can find in newspaper reporting every time tensions flare up in the Middle East, and they often subside as key players pull back from the brink. So why should now be any different? Perhaps the scale and intensity of the attacks mark this escalation out from previous ones. Israel has punched Iran very hard and gone after several targets to frustrate the regime's ability to punch back. Israeli jets struck targets in Iran on Friday morning. The US quickly sought to distance itself publicly from Benjamin Netanyahu's decision to target Tehran. There seems to be genuine fears that this attack could lead to all-out war in the Middle East. For now, at least, any hope of a deal between Trump and Iran to prevent the country from seeking a nuclear weapon would seem to be at best on hold, at worst sabotaged for the foreseeable future. Trump Despite inconsistency and weakness on many issues of foreign policy, especially over Ukraine, seems keen to prevent and close wars down rather than let new ones flare up. He therefore may not be happy about today's news from the Middle East. US officials have been referring to the strikes on Tehran as unilateral actions by Israel, but this surely is just wishful thinking. Iran will strike back, and Iran may not differentiate between Israel and the US involvement. Tonight, Israel took unilateral action against Iran, said Secretary of State Marco Rubio in a statement. We are not involved in strikes against Iran, and our top priority is protecting American forces in the region. He continued, Israel advised us that they believed this action was necessary for its self-defense. President Trump and the administration have taken all necessary steps to protect our forces and remain in close contact with our regional partners. Let me be clear, Iran should not target US interests or personnel. So the official response is neither to condemn nor condone, but distance the US and its interests from strikes that are being painted as purely an Israeli decision. Whether that's going to be at all successful, well, we'll find out in the next couple of days. Although Washington officials and analysts had expected Israel to hold off from strikes until the US exhausted attempts to negotiate a deal with Iran, it's quite possible that Israel struck precisely because of the chance of a deal, especially with Russia announcing its involvement in the negotiations. There's clearly some confusion in the US position right now, and some differences between the United States position and Israel's position, said William Weschler, the senior director of the Rafik Hariri Center and Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. Strikes took place just hours after Trump had publicly urged Netanyahu not to attack Iran. He said an Israeli offensive would blow up the negotiations. I'd love to avoid a conflict, Trump said in remarks from the White House on Thursday. We are close to a pretty good agreement. I'd much prefer an agreement. If I think there is an agreement, I don't want them going in because I think that would blow it. Well, they have gone in despite Trump's words. The US began pulling non-essential personnel out of embassies and bases in the Middle East within striking distance of Iran several days ago, a clear indicator of a major strike in the offing. There is a degree of ambiguity and confusion as the US has failed to suggest it would defend Israel from likely retaliation by Iran. We suspect that in reality, of course, it will. And of course, last year, Western militaries, led by the US, were conspicuous in defending Israeli skies from the barrage of rockets coming from various quarters. For Ukrainians, this created a jarring and frustrating impression because Western powers demonstrably have the capability, the capacity to clear the skies over Israel, but choose not to do so in Ukraine to prevent Russian attacks by rockets and drones, which are exacting a daily toll of death and injury. Now, there is an alternative way to look at the long-term failure of policy as described by Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who said the attack was clearly intended to scuttle the Trump administration's negotiation with Iran and is further evidence of how little respect world powers, including our own allies, have for President Trump. This is a disaster for Trump and Netanyahu's own making, and now the region risks spiraling towards a new deadly conflict. He added Iran would not be this close to possessing a nuclear weapon if Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu had not forced America out of the nuclear agreement with Iran that had brought Europe, Russia, and China together behind the United States to successfully contain Iran's nuclear ambitions. Famously, Trump scuppered that deal in his first presidency. Global oil prices have jumped in response to the attacks. Whether this is a short-term spike or a long-term trend will depend on how events pan out, but they could have huge implications for the war against Ukraine. Low oil prices present a huge risk to Putin's economy, but high oil prices may provide an injection of capital that could keep his war machine fueled with cash for another year or more. The prices of Brent and NYMEX light sweet crude were up by more than 10% shortly after the news emerged, hitting their highest levels since January. Now, the cost of crude oil affects everything from the price of food to filling up your car, and against this could create domestic pressure for Trump, who has an interest in driving down fuel prices and the cost of living for American consumers. It's largely thought that Trump was re-elected on the basis of his promise to drive down prices. So-called safe haven assets, such as gold and the Swiss franc, also made gains. In an extreme scenario, Iran could disrupt supplies of millions of barrels of oil a day if it targets infrastructure or shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is one of the world's most important shipping routes, with about a fifth of the world's oil passing through it. What we see now is initial risk on reaction. But over the next day or two, the market will need to factor in where this could escalate to. Saul Kavonik, head of energy research at MST Financial, was quoted as saying, "In a clear sign of the impending strike, the Pentagon ordered the withdrawal of troops and non-essential staff from embassies in Baghdad, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Previously, Iran's defense minister warned Tehran could strike American assets in the region if attacked. Iran may make no distinction between Israel and the US in this decision." Trump previously warned that either the US or Israel could carry out airstrikes targeting Iranian nuclear facilities if negotiations failed. In that case, America will have to leave the region, said Iran's defense minister, because all its bases are within our reach. We have access to them, and without hesitation, we will target all of them in the host countries, the minister told Iranian press. Is this posturing or real statement of intent? How likely was a nuclear deal in any case, we must ask? Domestic uranium enrichment in Iran can be used to generate nuclear energy for peaceful purposes or, of course, to build a bomb. Trump changed his stance during negotiations from initially showing flexibility on Iran being able to enrich uranium at low levels for nuclear power generation. Then he adopted the position of saying anything beyond zero enrichment in the country is unacceptable. Well, that, of course, is a deal breaker for Tehran. Tehran demands the right to a civilian nuclear energy program. Iran maintains that right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, which it joined in 1970, and which allows non-nuclear weapon states to build peaceful nuclear energy programs. But of course, Iran also may not want to lose the capability to produce weapons in the future as well. Iran's uranium enrichment has reached 60% purity, according to the IAEA. It's not a huge leap to get to the weapons grade purity level of 90%. A country enriching at 60% is a very serious thing. Only countries making bombs are reaching this level, IAEA chief Rafael Grossi said in 2021. Iranians are also quite irritated the US has not engaged substantively with the issue of sanctions relief. They are asking for clarification on that issue. They are chiefly interested in a deal that brings sanctions relief for their economy. The fact Iran has openly threatened to strike US assets directly if attacked is significant, according to Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. If there is a confrontation, and if the Iranians make true on their threat to target American bases, this is going to end up becoming a very, very devastating confrontation, Parsi said. And supporters of Trump from his own base are very worried that he will be jeopardizing his entire presidency over this issue, where in reality there is a diplomatic deal in reach. This situation highlights tensions and inconsistencies in the Trump regime. There is the tone and character of Trumpism that is highly isolationist and nativist, withdrawing from the concept of the US as the world's policeman, but at the same time, so much rhetoric from the administration is interventionist, aggressive, and even imperialist in tone, especially with regards to tariffs, Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal, and so on. Well, as per this new breaking news format, we're going to have an introduction and we're going to have a set of conclusions. Rather than just reporting on the news, we want to interpret them in terms of what is happening between Ukraine and Russia and the wider consequences of the breaking news that we analyze. The wide-scale attack to decapitate the Iranian serpent will have consequences. But lobbing missiles at Israel will likely not result in outright war, direct war. It depends whether Israel widens the scope of targets and launches other attacks. Iran will not dare strike US interests, as Trump's reactions are highly unpredictable and could be extremely reactive and capricious. It's entirely possible as well that Russia will step in to try and cool things down because they need Trump on side in order to support their policies of attacking Ukraine. In this circumstance, Russia may see Trump as an unstable asset, and they may seek to try and contain and restabilize him in order to meet their own foreign policy objectives. Partial evacuations of US staff were a signal of the impending strike, but such a blow by Israel to check the progress of Iran's nuclear program has long been expected. It should not come as a huge surprise. The question is, probably also, was it expected by Iran? The answer, of course, is yes. So what part of the nuclear programs have Iran hidden out of reach or placed additional security over? That is a question for experts. It seems on balance the US talk of a deal with Iran was genuine, but the negotiating stance was unlikely to lead to a concrete deal soon, especially given Trump's change towards zero enrichment. Trump's attention span would likely have expired anyway, long before any deal was struck. Looking at the oil price spike, the reaction, this is going to be the key question, whether that is a long-term trend or whether this is just a short-term spike. If it is over the long term and we see significant disruption of oil transit through the Strait of Hormuz, then this seriously risks prolonging the war in Ukraine. It risks propping up Putin's regime, propping up his war machine for a year or maybe even several years to come. The diversion of air missile components to Iran perhaps is no longer specifically an anti-Ukraine measure, and we can see in the context of the Middle East why that decision may have been taken. However, the trend in the US is towards de-supporting Ukraine, so that narrative is still important, and Ukraine is unlikely to receive substantial aid from the US moving forward, at least during Trump's term of office. And it's a key question, and this one is tricky to answer. Is Iran distracted from supporting Russia in Ukraine through the supply of munitions? Well, probably the impact of this is going to be minimal, as the transfer of Shaheed manufacturing, it was pretty much complete. The missiles and artillery shells for Russia and to continue its aggression are coming from North Korea largely now, not Iran. And soon drone production facilities will be firing up in North Korea too, managed by the Russians. It's also been said that the initially inaccurate artillery and missile systems that North Korea was providing, these are being made substantially more accurate through the intervention and guidance of Russian experts. Well, we have to look at North Korea as well as Iran because this relationship between Russia and North Korea may be an even greater threat to world peace and especially European security, but it gets far, far less attention in the media. Now, the spectacle of Western military defending Israeli skies and clearly not defending Ukraine would again create frustration and dissonance as Ukraine is increasingly being hammered by an intense campaign of terror by Russia. And that is scaling up massively in ferocity, frequency, and the sheer number of drones that are being sent in to kill Ukrainians. So close the skies by all means over Israel, but close them over Ukraine, close them over Gaza. Block offensive capabilities, yes, but also we should be doing this to shield civilians from the devastating impact of strikes wherever that happens. Now, before we fall into the trap of sympathizing with Iran, remember that for 3 years its drones have been terrorizing Ukrainians in their homes. The scales of these attacks has massively intensified, and Iran places no limits whatsoever on the usage of its munitions supplied to Russia. Iran does not care about their use, and it does not care about war crimes. Finally, let's conclude. This strike on Iran by Israel will largely be seen in the media through the lens of A attacks B, B attacks C, etc., etc. But there is a commonality between the conflicts in the world now. Aggression and escalation are largely coming from regimes that have more of an ideological and theocratic nature. It comes from regimes that are becoming less expressive of the will of their populations, and from countries that are dismantling the institutions and processes whereby governance reflects the will of the people. States that have lost the art of pragmatism and humanism in foreign policy are on the attack. Iran, Russia, North Korea, Israel, and increasingly the US can be seen as an ideological and theocratic state that is enabling uncertainty, and even in the case of Russia, Ukraine, enabling aggression.